Thank you for joining us. If everybody can take a seat, we'll try to begin. Thank you and welcome to USTelecom's 9th Cybersecurity Policy Forum. I'm very glad that you were all able to come and to machete through this wonderfully cool weather that we're having here in Washington, D.C. And a special welcome to the Board of Directors and Leadership Committee of USTelecom that has arrived just yesterday and today from parts all over the nation to join together for our annual retreat. Very, very glad to welcome our USTelecom Board and Leadership Committee. Thank you very much for making the effort to come. I also just want to say hello to the folks who are not in the room but are joining us across the country via live stream this afternoon. It's an important conversation to have nationally, and we welcome those who are watching us via broadband. Today, we're lucky to convene leaders from not only the White House, but the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Commerce, and across the private sector to dive deep into an issue that we know is top of mind for virtually every global institution here and around the world. Without question, increasingly ubiquitous and powerful broadband connectivity has been a profoundly positive transformational force across virtually every aspect of our economy and our lives. But with this great power, we know also comes great responsibility, the responsibility to share in the security of our institutions and our citizens against a variety of emerging threats that we are confronting. It's now, sadly, all too familiar for us to wake up to the latest news about a major attack on a global enterprise, small enterprises, across all sectors, across all geographies. In fact, just today, we heard of an attack that has actually impacted several American small broadband providers, some of whom now are off network. This is a ubiquitous and perpetual issue that we are confronting in real time every day. As these assaults become more frequent, they also become more disruptive to our global economy and, we know as well, to our national security. The digital tools of our adversaries often demonstrate nation-state level sophistication. Yet these weapons, we know also, are falling into the hands of actors with significantly darker motivations and equally low economic barriers to entry. This is the world we now face. And the fundamental question before us is, how do we maintain a free and open society with a thriving and resilient digital economy while upholding the values of openness, transparency, and freedom that we all cherish and that we in the broadband industry cherish? This may be the defining challenge of our time, to solve these complex, daunting problems that can at times unfortunately seem intractable. Only by working in nimble and collaborative ways across public and private sectors can we develop and successfully execute new and superior digital tools that can outwit those who would use technology to tear down and divide and exploit rather than lift up and build. As we explore today the policies that are needed to achieve these outcomes, let us remain committed to the flexible, cost-effective, public-private engagement model that remains the cornerstone of our nation's cyber defense, where cooperation and coordination with key leaders in government is standard operating procedure. In fact, we're very lucky today to have one such government leader who is now leading President Trump's important cybersecurity initiatives and efforts at the White House, very close by. And it is really my pleasure, it is our pleasure, to welcome White House Cybersecurity Coordinator Rob Joyce to the forum today. Thank you very much. Let me just give him a little bit about your background. Quite distinguished. Before joining the White House, Rob ran the National Security Agency's Office of Tailored Access Operations, which is also known as the Hacking Division, working tirelessly on both offense and defense to protect U.S. systems and networks from cyber threats. He's here to speak with us today about the recent Cybersecurity Executive Order that President Trump signed. Rob is going to be in charge of its implementation across agencies, across governments, and across the nation, strengthening federal network cybersecurity and overall critical infrastructure by transforming federal agency practices, addressing longstanding concerns about botnets and other malicious activities, considering deterrence options to deal with adversaries, and fourth, promoting greater international cooperation and harmonization in the cyber arena globally. It's a very, very significant and important and mission-critical agenda that he will be leading. So we welcome you, Rob, and we appreciate your leadership, the White House's leadership, and we look forward to your insights and also to continuing our collaboration and cooperation in the days ahead. Rob, please join the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak. I am really lucky to be working in cybersecurity. This is an area where I don't have to start out by selling the need for this activity, right? Especially at the types of groups I get to talk to. You live it each and every day. And in this space, we're also blessed by that sense of urgency. Each and every one of you interacts, whether it's in your business life or your personal life, and understands the threats we're under. There was a great introduction to some of the forces we're facing. And as I look to it, cyberspace has become a major area of conflict where we have liberal and illiberal forces really trying to shape that space. Because unlike the physical world, where walls are incredibly effective, where we have the distance of oceans at times, we are in a common space on the internet. And that brings those who would do us harm right inside our fence line. This interconnectivity really brings the biggest strategic challenge we've had since 9/11. As I look to it, cyber offense is too easy today. It's too inexpensive for those who would push those activities. And because of that, what we need to do is we have to increase our resilience. We have to be responsive and able to do deterrence by driving up the costs for those who would seek to do those things. But again, I really think a key cornerstone to that is defense and our resilience, because in the end, we've got to make it so that it isn't as attractive to come in and try these activities. And there's got to be some doubt that they'll succeed, and there's got to be strong doubt that they can succeed without consequence. And so that's what we've been looking at. So it's been 70 days since President Trump signed the Executive Order 13800, which was strengthening the security of federal networks and critical infrastructure. I'd like to really talk about that executive order and where it's headed, and then branch off into a couple of the specialty areas that I think will be most relevant to this group. But as far as priorities, the first priority in that executive order, and there were three real pillars, is federal cybersecurity. So we operate those networks on behalf of the American people. And when we do that, I say on behalf of the American people because you only have to look to some of the breaches like OPM, where we lost the clearance database for government workers. That's a heinous breach. But it not only contained my clearance information, but it contained information from my children who are also on that filing. It contained information from my neighbors and my parents who are also on that filing. So average people who are not in the government were impacted by that breach. Now consider if we had lost the Social Security database or the IRS database, how heinous would that be, right? So that's what I mean when we say we operate these networks on behalf of the American people. When you step back as well, it's a national security threat too. If we can't count on these federal networks, we are in danger in our national security space. So it means the risks that we take, the decisions we make about securing those infrastructures have wide implications. And so first order of business is understand those risks. Any single risk can be considered on its own whether a system is secure or not secure, but what we've learned are these systems are interconnected and interdependent. And if you have a vulnerability in one, it can be leveraged through beyond that point and get to other activities. So in the executive order, we've called for a review of what risk decisions have the agencies made and accepted, because they've done that on behalf of the whole American government. And we want to make sure that we have the insights to treat the federal infrastructure as an architecture and a system. Not meaning that it's one big network, but the risks across it need to be considered in aggregate because they do connect to each other. I am a strong believer that you can't defend that which you don't know. So if you don't know what that network is and what the piece parts are inside it, we are not going to succeed in defending it. The other piece we're focused on in the federal arena is modernization. A lot of these items and issues are just indefensible because they're no longer supported. There are ways to buy down that risk. There are at times reasons to accept that risk, but we really need to be conscious of those risks and decisions we're making, again, so that we can treat the whole of the risk space together. When you step back and think about driving down risks, one of the best ways these days to drive down risk is just to modernize. And so we are going to look to those inefficient and hard to defend systems, and we're going to look to upgrade those. We're going to look to modern technology. We're going to favor cloud services and shared services. So the president has directed that in the executive order, that our procurement decisions should be weighted toward those outcomes. And by looking at shared services, at that point, we can get a lot of efficiencies. We can also get the experts to work on that system, and we won't take small groups who are not proficient in a technology and ask them to carry the weight of that technology. And they even may make a great decision today, but that system then in a legacy position or a department or agency that doesn't emphasize it may find that system still exists 10 years from now and it's not supportable any longer. So finally, one of the big changes we're also trying to drive is cultural. So the idea is I meet with CEOs and executives from private industry. I often see you dedicating your time to cybersecurity decisions and issues. I see you collaborating across industries to think about those risks. And that gives me great pleasure because what I find is you all pull each other up and improve, and you also direct back down with your time, attention, and resources improvements in your cybersecurity posture. So your companies are often finding existential threats from cybersecurity, right? If you're breached, it may be the end of a company in some cases. In the government, we don't often see the heads of departments and agencies thinking with that same mentality, right? That it's existential to their job, their mission, and their trust. And so we're trying to drive that the heads of departments and agencies, we are all in the federal government responsible for these risk decisions, but in the end, their decision to fund or not fund an upgrade, their decision to spend time and ask the criteria that their department has used to bring that risk upon them and the federal government is often a question that goes unasked. And so it's clear in the executive order now, accountability is with the department and agency heads to understand and invest their time and energies into those things. So the second big area for the executive order is critical infrastructure, and that's where you all come in, right? Most of the critical infrastructure in the U.S. is not owned and operated by the government, right? It is by, through, and with companies. And so we need a strong partnership by which we enable with the skills and capabilities the government brings to help you augment the security, the resilience, the recovery options for the critical infrastructure we depend on. So we've named 16 sectors, critical infrastructure, but there's lifeline sectors in that all of us would step back and say are really at the top of the list. And telecommunications is one of them. Certainly electric power is another. The financial industry, all of those are linked, right? If you think about it, right, your industry can't continue if the power is out. right? You'll keep it up for a while, but there's a point at which the generators, the batteries, the backup systems are just not going to sustain. So that interconnectiveness is something we're recognizing. Same thing with the financial sector, right? They rely on your comms and your backbones to move their digital transactions. And then all of that still rides on an assumption that the power is there. Your businesses can continue for some amount of time without the financial sector, but all three legs of that stool can interplay and cause huge risk to any other element. So you will see the government encouraging things like cross-sector exercises where we think about in a more realistic, more sustained way of how one sector impacts another. And we start to work those playbooks. So the day we have a cyber disaster, it's not the first time we're all talking to each other and thinking about these activities, right? It's really key that we practice the way we're going to play. So we would welcome your thoughts on how we as the government would do more cross-sector engagements and what would be realistic exercises and what would be most valuable in doing those activities. And then the big question I'd love to hear from you and your sector is, what value does the government add in this, right? Where do we bring things only the U.S. government can provide? I understand the things you're responsible for and you're going to bring, and we need to have that collaboration to really understand in advance where we connect and how we blend to secure critical infrastructure. And so I need to know, what is helpful and not helpful from the federal government in that space. So third priority in this area is international partnerships. We've made some really good progress in recent years in building consensus around responsible state behavior. So those norms of what is acceptable and unacceptable, it's really important to talk about the rule of law applies both in cyberspace as it does in the physical world. It's really important to hold up the values that we have in that area. And now that we have those norms and definitions of responsible state behavior, we need to hold nations accountable when they violate that consensus. We need to think about moving from talking about norms to implementing the ones we have. So as we look to some of the differences between our vision of the internet and those held by some others, I think we recognize the internet's vulnerable to fragmenting, right? There isn't big agreement in all corners about the free and open internet that was discussed at your opening. And for us, the internet was the product of American innovation, and we need to ensure that it continues to reflect our values. So in this push to understand responsible state behavior, that's going to be a core tenet for us. So as we look to push ahead on these three areas of the pillars of the EO, there's a foundation beneath it, and that foundation is a workforce. So our strategic advantage, the idea that we innovated, the idea that your companies are strong is often built on the technical prowess of Americans. The idea that we go out and are never satisfied with that technology we're using, that we continue to push, whether it's taking the newest innovation and figuring out how to get that out to a massive market across a huge country, or whether it's thinking about better ways to implement and execute in the technology space we need. There's constant innovation, and the only way we have that is when we continue to build strong, deep technical expertise. And so the fourth piece of the EO focuses on what can we do as the government, and what do we need from academic, private institutions, and others to really have that critical strategic advantage of a workforce. So we will look to broaden our cyber and education programs and exploring best practices. There are people around the world that do some of this really well and innovatively, and so we're going to look to capture some of those as well. So that's kind of a quick overview of the Trump administration's cyber priorities. And if you think about in those three big pillars and the base, you will understand how we're talking about ways to move forward. The EO is an initial starting point. You'll see a lot of it calling for information and data. We've already started to get things like international priorities from the departments and agencies. That was a deliverable already produced. That's an internal deliverable that now goes to State Department, where they are working the overall strategy for international priorities. There's work been done on deterrence and thinking about those big areas of how do we impose those costs? How do we drive down the opportunity to come at us, our critical infrastructure, and our people? And there's also big efforts in that space to think about where we need to move the needle in terms of the workforce. And there's already been one intelligence piece that talks about how other countries are doing this and the threats we see from their workforce development. So good progress being made, a lot still to go. We're moving very fast in terms of government speed on reports, because when we had things like 45-day deliverables, when they have to go through department coordination and something as big as the Department of Defense, up through a secretary and get through the multiple steps on the way there, and then out the door to the interagency review, and the ones that go to the president have that extra staffing. There's not much time in this space, and so we're moving hard and charging. I'm really proud of the departments and agencies, the progress they're making, whether it's DHS, DOD, Commerce, and a host of others who are really carrying a huge load in the work that we're doing at the administration. They're the backbone, and they're delivering. They're doing an awesome job. One area we called out specifically, and I think would be of interest here, is our efforts against botnets. That was a very specific call out in the executive order. And we did that because a lot of experts consider botnets to be one of the most significant threats in the cyber realm, but also one we can probably make a lot of progress on, right? So we didn't specify the outcome, we didn't direct the path, but it was really a call to arms, saying that we need leadership out of the Department of Commerce and the Department of Homeland Security to enhance our resilience against botnets and other distributed threats. And we did that having looked back at things like the Mirai botnet, right, where cheap, insecure commercial commodity technology was leveraged to bring down substantial parts of the internet. Right? And I think the telecommunications firms in this room, some of the developers of technology can have a big part in making botnets much less effective, much less pervasive. And what we're looking to do is have that government and industry partnership to talk about what are the technologies we need, what are the operational decisions we need, what are the sharing and information processes we need, and what are the operational requirements that will let us work very aggressively as people try to stand these up to make them ineffective. So for me, I think about where we're headed. Today, you can get an exceptionally powerful computer for under $1, right? The CPU that can be deployed for just a small amount of money makes it highly likely that more and more things are just going to be, from the beginning, internet connected and cyber enabled. So we will see, products that come out with high-end Linux computers that are embedded for under $1. That's why you almost can't buy a television today without internet connectivity, because it's so cheap compared to the whole TV to throw that small part inside there and then add all of the functionality. So now you're seeing that expand, and we see things that are internet connected appliances or cars that have hundreds of CPUs to include that connectivity. But what we need to consider in that is, what are the cybersecurity implications of that? How do you patch it? How do you upgrade it? How do you make sure from the beginning that it can't be exploited and brought into this botnet scenario? So I am, much to the chagrin of my wife, what is called an early adopter. Right? So I go out there and I grab technology and I play with it. And one of the things I did as a pet project was I put a little CPU on the side of our washing machine, and it will text us when the washer and dryer are done. Right? So do I need it? No. Is it convenient? Absolutely, right? So now if I'm in another part of the house, the dryer stops, I don't forget about it, and the clothes don't get wrinkled, right? So that's great, it's a convenience. If that went down, it wouldn't matter at all to my lifestyle. But now I am in the situation where I have to patch my washing machine, right? So think about that scenario. When was the last time you patched your washing machine? Right? It's not a common thing. So we need to build the technology so I don't have to think about patching my washing machine, right? The average folk, it needs to be transparent and capable. And we can't build technology that's just going to sit there, because in the end, a lot of these appliances are bought with the expectation that they will be viable for years. And if you look back at technology that's been deployed 5, 10, 15 years ago, today, by new exploits, new capabilities, it is insecure. And so how do we build that future proofing of thinking about cybersecurity from the beginning of that product life cycle so that botnets are not able to harvest these devices in massive scale and massive quantity, capture their distributed computing, capture their distributed power, capture their distributed connectivity, and then make it a liability for our businesses, our critical infrastructure, our governments, or even our individuals, right? So that's the challenge, and that's where the botnet focus is. And I would hope all of you are taking some of your best talent and your best ideas and contributing to these activities. We've got multiple threads underway. I mentioned the DHS and Department of Commerce effort. NIST is under that Department of Commerce rubric with DHS and others, convening workshops. They did a workshop last week, July 12th and 13th, gathering some of that industry effort. We also asked the President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, the NSTAC, to produce a report on the private sector and government, how they could collaborate to improve resilience. And I think that, you know, the botnet threat falls under some of that resilience and is in an early stage of research. So, you know, what have we learned in kind of those 70 days of looking at that? Everybody agrees that this is an international problem. It's not one the U.S. can solve alone, right? If we can be perfect and still suffer the fate of, you know, cheap devices that come from other nations that really aren't secured or securable, and they can be compromised and use their distributed power to bring us problems. And I think everyone agrees, though, that U.S. needs to lead the way. We've tried to step out in describing what we believe is important for the cybersecurity future. And so the Internet of Things and botnet is something we're challenging our industry partners, our academics, and some of these government places to step in and lead that way. I think the experts also agree there's good tools available to address the threats, but they have to be applied. And when I say that, you know, it ranges from the concepts of things we can do at the backbone level all the way down to, boy, that device ought to be auto-updated, and it ought to auto-update with a cryptographically signed piece of firmware that you can authenticate is from a reasonable source. So most of those issues come from the need to build in security from the beginning rather than bolt it on, and that's tough in a market that's trying to drive at cheap, low cost and first to market. But we also see this as an interconnected problem, meaning we're going to need multiple sectors to help this, from the manufacturers through the ISPs and TCOMs to the government entities to international partners. So with that, I'll wrap up. I think we're building toward our final reports to the President, and with that, you know, focusing on the key areas we have to improve and draw the partnerships, whether they're international partnerships with industry, or connecting the tissue across government to really solve these problems. Tough challenge, but one that everybody is very motivated to work toward. And appreciate your support and help, you know, in this industry council in that space as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Please have a seat. We'll just have a quick series of questions for you, but let me just start by saying I was intrigued by your CPU attached to your washer dryer. I think there are some CEOs and business leaders here who'd be very interested in sharing with you their smart home products. and also some of their cloud services to manage them.
It might be built on some of that, but as a government employee, I can't
All right,
endorse an individual product, so I'll be careful there.
But more seriously, thank you for your vision and also your perspective on the implementation of the executive order and also the White House's approach to prioritizing cybersecurity and the importance of public-private engagement on that. That's very important. I thought we would begin with a bit of a level set, Rob. We have seen some very serious attacks recently. How would you characterize the threat trajectory as you're looking at the near future?
Yeah. So I started at the beginning of the speech, with the concerns we have. I would say, the threat is growing. It's going in the wrong direction by almost any measure you want to take today. The good news is part of the reason for that trajectory is the success we're having with industry getting key technologies out there. But we are one of the most interconnected, digitally dependent countries in the world. Mm-hmm. And so that makes us some of the most vulnerable. And we really need to invest and turn that curve before it's an even greater problem.
Oh, I would agree. And you said in that framework that the executive order places responsibility for the federal government's cybersecurity efforts squarely with department and agency leaders. The question is, as you drill down a little bit into that, what does this really say about shared responsibility for cybersecurity within the federal government as an operating practice?
Yeah. So for me, it means we've got to change the culture, right? We've got to make the mindset of leadership believe that it is their accountable problem to work on and not something they just delegate to the CIO, CISO, and CTO, and then walk away and assume they've got it. Because in the end, those leadership decisions they're making every day, starting with the budget, but signaling with their time and attention, are the things that are going to help improve the federal cybersecurity. And I would say in private industry, it's also going to be the same thing, right? And so we look to, I thank President Trump for his leadership. Signing out an executive order this early in his presidency showed that he cares significantly about cybersecurity, and he's going to make it a priority. So that was a huge help to us as well.
And we all as a sector, broadly, the ICT sector, are very grateful to President Trump and to your efforts to prioritize cybersecurity so early on in the administration with the executive order. Taking it a little bit beyond the federal perspective, you've mentioned that the executive order also has a pathway for international engagement. And from a global perspective, can you give us a little more detail of what progress you're hoping to make internationally? And what do you perceive must be done from a longer-term perspective internationally to create a more resilient and safer digital economy?
So I think in the international world, there are a lot of efforts that are going to be encouraged and pushed through multinational partnership. Right? The UN, the GGE experts in the UN did a lot of work building and promoting norms. The work that we do on standard bodies to push standards and evolve as we understand better the threats that are coming at our networks, our technology, the vulnerabilities that we didn't appreciate when a product was first released or a standard was first set. That is just so fundamental to having cybersecurity. But while those international bodies are important and necessary to do things across the whole of the globe, there are times when we need to go to the deterrence lever, and what we found is big international bodies don't do deterrence well. Right? You fall to the lowest common denominator of all the group. And so I think you're going to see us finding like-minded partners who will stand up and say enough on some of the cyber issues. And we're going to look to lead by example in addressing those cybersecurity issues. And it won't always happen in those multinational forums because of the speed and agility we find there.
Well, and lastly, I know you have a tight agenda, and we thank you for sharing some of your time with us today. You bring a particularly interesting perspective to your important work now at the White House from your perch for decades at the NSA. What aspects of your experience working in the NSA do you find most useful in your current role? And can you just share a little bit about how that background has prepared you to take on this broad interagency and indeed international coordination effort that you're now leading?
Yeah. So NSA prepared me well as part of the interagency. You know, we work with all of the various elements across the government who are involved in cybersecurity, and so I've got a long list of close partners and resources I can draw upon. Industry as well, so understanding what industry brings and appreciating that. But most importantly for me was the movement back and forth between defensive and SIGINT operations, because it really let me understand what practical exploitation means. And you know, you can have great defenses in your networks and your architecture. The people who look to exploit you are not going to come at the best piece of your defense. They're going to poke and prod. They're going to find the thing you didn't know was in your architecture, or the thing that you thought was okay to leave there because there's only one of it. And they're going to find that vulnerability, and that's the vulnerability you'll use. So, you know, I would use the expression, it takes a thief to catch a thief. It takes somebody who has done red team or exploitation to really understand what true vulnerabilities look like, and understand that you can talk about the defenses you intend to have, but in the end, it's the defenses you do have that matter. And so you've got to pay attention to the basic blocking and tackling. It's cyber hygiene is not sexy nor exciting, but if you do the cyber hygiene right, it makes it so much more difficult to be exploited. And you've got to be constantly considering what is in your architecture, what's changed about it, and what new things should you be worried about that have been discovered about the stuff you're using. And that's what it takes to lash down tightly on your infrastructure.
Well, that's absolutely fundamental, and I must say that on behalf of a very grateful broadband community, we are all very lucky that somebody with your perspective, your experience, and your field of vision on these issues, both operationally, tactically, and strategically, are now out there on the barricade swinging the machete on behalf of us all on cybersecurity issues at the White House. We are very grateful for your public service. And all of our members at USTelecom are ready and willing to do whatever we can to cooperate, to coordinate, and to aid this collective urgent challenge. So thank you very, very much for spending some time with us. We're going to transit to my good colleague, Robert Mayer, and a distinguished panel that he will be leading. But before we do that, I just wanted to say on behalf of everybody, we're very grateful for your
Okay, good afternoon, folks. I think we're somewhere between the main entree and the dessert. So first of all, I want to thank all of you here for attending. We have not only a large audience here, but we have even a larger audience joining us by live stream. I think we just heard what speaks to the enormous opportunities and challenges that we face. But one thing is absolutely certain: we need the best minds from government, industry, academia, and society writ large to solve problems that are only becoming more challenging with time. We're very fortunate today to have some of the very best minds with us today, both on the panel and in the audience. And this is an opportunity to explore some of the comments made by Mr. Joyce, as well as some of the most pressing issues related to the recent executive order and general cyber trends and developments. So without further ado, let me do some quick introductions, and you will find some additional biographical information in the packets. So, to my immediate right, I want to welcome Evelyn Romele, who is the Deputy Associate Administrator for the Office of Policy Development and Analysis at NTIA under the Department of Commerce. Evelyn and her colleagues are leading several major multi-stakeholder initiatives in the cyber arena, and she will also be able to talk about some of the coordinated activities involving both NTIA and the sister agency under the Department of Commerce, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. To Evelyn's left, we have Tom McDermott, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity Policy with the Department of Homeland Security. Tom oversees the development of policy positions related to the full range of cyber technology, infrastructure, and resilience issues, and we are very appreciative to DHS for sending us someone at a senior level with such a broad portfolio. To Tom's left, we have Kirsten Todd, who is currently the President and Managing Partner of Liberty Group Ventures. Many of you know that Kirsten was a leading facilitator in working with NIST and industry to develop the 2014 NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 1.0. More recently, Kirsten was the Executive Director of the President's Commission on Enhancing Cybersecurity, and I have to say, with many top management executives here in the audience today, it was no easy task to get 12 very independent senior leaders in industry to come to consensus on such a large variety of issues. Next to Kirsten is Ari Schwartz, who is currently the Managing Director of Cybersecurity Services at Venable LLP. Ari is no stranger to those of us who have worked closely with top U.S. government officials on national cybersecurity policy over these many years. Ari served at the White House National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of Cybersecurity. Before that, Ari led the Department of Commerce's Internet Policy Task Force. And finally, my two very esteemed colleagues who work every day to ensure that the private sector is fully engaged at the strategic planning and operational level with our U.S. government partners. They represent not only the broad industry sector, but also two of the largest carriers of global internet traffic. Catherine is the Director of National Security Emergency Preparedness for CenturyLink Communications, and she's the Vice Chair of the Communication Sector Coordinating Council. And Chris is the Assistant Vice President for Global Public Policy, responsible for the company's policy positions and advocacy related to cybersecurity. Chris also chairs the Federal Advisory Board known as the Information Security and Privacy Advisory Board, which advises numerous federal agencies on policy. And I think I was remiss in not introducing myself as Robert Mayer with USTelecom Vice President of Industry and State Affairs. So with that, let's begin with the questions. And I'd like to start with our two government officials here, and first, Evelyn. Evelyn, your organization have been given major responsibilities, individually and in collaboration, under the executive order, with what I'm sure you agree are very aggressive timelines. If anybody wants to look at the packet we left outside, here's a statement of all the directives that came out of the executive order, 16 reports, many of which in a very short period of time. So I would ask you a couple of questions. One, how is your organization, how is your agency working resources to meet the tasks and deadlines that are underway? And a follow-up question, how dependent are you in mobilizing the private sector in partnership? And what can you do, or what are you doing to make sure you have the right participants at the table?
Thank you, Robert. First of all, just thank you for having me here today, especially with this all-star team and with all of you. It's true, we're working hard at Commerce to meet all the Cybersecurity Executive Order deliverables. One of our largest tasks that we're involved in is the botnet task, which Rob talked about. And frankly, we feel a little flush with time on this one because compared to the other tasks, we have a year from when the Cybersecurity Executive Order was released. But frankly, you know, we fought hard for that, advocated hard because we thought very strongly that this needed to be an open and transparent process. And we're very glad that we've been given the go-ahead to do it in that manner. And at Commerce, of course, we have a lot of experience with doing this type of open process, reaching out to our stakeholders, engaging them in the process, and we know from experience that it's important to do that right. In terms of the question about that partnership, of course, you know, we view it as essential. One thing that we've tried to do is to leverage the multi-stakeholder relationships that we've already built through the other processes that we have underway at Commerce. This has allowed us to reach out to some of the partners that we don't often see in Washington meetings, such as the cybersecurity research community, technical experts, some of the smaller manufacturers. By focusing on vulnerability coordination and IoT patchability and upgradability in our processes, we've been able to get a diverse group. And these same people, we think, are going to be very critical for the botnet process as well. Just yesterday in our IoT patchability process, the stakeholder group was able to release guidance for small manufacturers and what they should be communicating to customers in terms of their upgrade process for new products. So we think activities such as this and outcomes from those processes are going to be important inputs to what we're doing on the botnet task. So again, we're trying to leverage all of the relationships that we've already had in addition to the botnet workshop that we did with NIST, the RFC that NTIA has out there right now that closes on July 28th, and through the DHS NSTAC study that's going on, that this is going to be a good way to get the right partnership ideas into the process.
Thank you, Evelyn. Tom, you have also a significant set of tasks ahead of you. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the priority tasks that you're focusing on and what your expectations are in the near term and maybe within the next year regarding some of those activities.
Sure, thank you, and that's my pleasure to be here, and so I thank you for the opportunity. For better or for worse, and sometimes it feels like for worse, the Department of Homeland Security is the lead or the co-lead in the vast majority of the tasks in the executive order. So as Rob said, we are coming up on the 90-day deliverables, the sort of the second set of deliverables in DHS is lead or co-lead for for all six of those 90-day deliverables. So it feels both like a sprint and like a marathon all at the same time. You know, we have sort of recognizing that we have organized ourselves to try to pull resources from across the department to bolster and leverage our ability to meet all of those deliverables on the very aggressive timelines that the White House gave us. in terms of the role of the private sector and how important it is to mobilize industry, I mean, I think the answer is absolutely critical. Certainly, we recognize at DHS that all of these tasks, implicate or involve the private sector and industry. We recognize that, we welcome that, but I've also been saying that we view these deliverables as very much the beginning of the conversation and not the end of the conversation. And I think Rob did a good job of teeing this up. A lot of the deliverables are meant to collect information, to sort of survey what's out there, gather that information, and present it to the White House, present it to policymakers, so that we can chart sort of policy options and conversations going forward. So, unfortunately, a lot of the reality of the 90-day deadlines for a lot of the critical tasks just have really constrained our ability to do as much engagement as we would like. I am incredibly jealous of the year time frame for the botnet task. I wish we had a year for a lot of our tasks. So we are doing what we can to get stakeholder involvement, industry input. We had an event just last week at the Chamber of Commerce that was focused on the market transparency report. So it was at least some opportunity to hear from the private sector about views about sort of current federal policies and practices about market transparency, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail later if it's useful. But we are somewhat constrained by the time, so we are finding ways to engage with industry where we can, and also recognizing that a lot of these deliverables are going to set the stage, and there will be sort of many more conversations with industry to come, and as we sort of work to jointly tackle these issues going forward.
Thank you. Kirsten, in December of 2016, you delivered a report to the President after spending 6 months or more working with leaders in industry and academia and a lot of stakeholders on scoping out some of the key issues around cybersecurity national policy. I'm wondering if you could share with us, from your perspective, what were some of the most important findings that came out of that effort, and how can they or should they be leveraged as we go forward now in rethinking cybersecurity policy without having to reinvent the wheel and looking at a lot of the issues you explored?
Thanks, Robert, and thanks very much to USTelecom. And I know this effort was a long time in the making, but good things go to those who wait, Robert. So what a fantastic event and group of people. It's certainly wonderful to hear from Rob this morning. So I would say that from the Commission perspective, the overarching theme really was looking at cybersecurity from a risk management view. And so when the executive order came out in May, with that as an overriding theme, I think everybody had a sense of, okay, we're evolving on this topic. We're looking at this and what the future should be, and we're not getting stuck in compliance checklists or anything like that. And so really looking at risk management as a driver. The other real key issue that, while it was only one of the 8, it ended up threading through a lot of the recommendations was IoT and interdependencies. And Rob obviously talked a lot about that, whether it's your washing machine or your refrigerator. Too many things are talking to you in your house, and there's an understanding that those things are talking to things a lot more serious than just your appliances. And so really understanding that these interdependencies need to be addressed. And what was fascinating from the Commission perspective is in May, when we first started our deliberation, there was a discussion around IoT devices that are life-affecting. So looking at medical devices, pacemakers, and driverless cars. And then, as Rob cited, you had the Mirai and the Dyn attack in the fall. And what that really demonstrated was this challenge around IoT security and looking at the interdependencies that security now is becoming reliant upon. And so we did put forward in the Commission report this idea of how do you develop IoT standards. And obviously we were really pleased to see how it was outlined in the executive order and all of the efforts on the part of government through Commerce, with DHS, with NIST, to really start looking at the idea that we need to be looking at how to secure IoT. And how do we get to a place where secure to market overrides first to market, particularly with these proliferation of devices. The second key aspect is looking at how does industry and government work together. And we made a deliberate effort not to talk about public-private partnerships only because that's a phrase that has lost so much meaning, but it is still what needs to happen. It's public-private collaboration. And when we talk about information sharing, we talk about it as a destination. We often say, you know, what is the ISACs? There are these entities that were formed initially for the destination of information sharing. We're now at a place in our existence, our evolution with where the threat is, that information sharing should be a byproduct of trust, collaboration, and relationships. And that comes from, and Rob talked about this very effectively, obviously, looking at pre-event collaboration. And so understanding how do government and industry work together before something happens and on a regular basis, so that, as everybody knows from exercising, you're not looking at the person who you're dependent upon for the first time after an event. As we all know, government does incident response really well, and we have a lot of examples of that. But what government and industry need to be focusing on together at a senior level is what do we need to do before something actually happens to prepare and to create that resilient environment. And I think that's the other part of this, is really looking at the consumer, workforce. How do we educate and train individuals to create environments of resiliency and a strong culture around security? And we talk a lot in the report about consumers and educating consumers, this fascinating tension, which the Commission ended up defining as not a tension, which is moving security away from the end user, but also educating individuals. Because when we talk about a cyber workforce, when we talk about the cybersecurity environment in which we're living, everybody is a part of the cybersecurity workforce. If you go to the store, you're swiping your credit card through Square. If you're looking at anything, if you're using a device, you're part of that workforce. So we no longer have an excuse to say this knowledge actually gets confined to this group of people. Every one of us with a smartphone in our pockets, in our pocketbooks, however you carry it, we are all part of this workforce. And so creating this cultural shift around security, whether it's through educating the consumer, developing a more and highly trained, skilled workforce in this field, and investing in the R&D around cybersecurity and IoT security needs to really happen. And so I think, you know, just in conclusion, we were really pleased to see how the government, through the partnerships that everyone worked so hard on last year, really identified and took a lot of those recommendations and evolved them. The botnet one is, and Evelyn might be cursing the Commission at some point, but the botnet one, as you know, Robert, because of the tremendous efforts of USTelecom and individuals in this room, really was one of the key lead recommendations. And so there's a lot, I think, that's happened through this executive order, a lot of efforts underway. It's no small task, but it's a tremendous team that's executing on it.
Thank you, Kirsten. Ari, you've been in a unique position where you've been in leadership positions thinking about national security policy at important agencies like the Department of Commerce, leading the Internet Policy Task Force, but then also right in the center of the National Security Council, cybersecurity. My question to you is, as you think about how things evolved over the course of those years and where we are now, from a policy perspective and an engagement perspective, are we keeping pace with the threat, or are we at risk of things slipping in such a way that the adversaries are going to become, the gap between our capabilities to defend ourselves and the capabilities of the adversaries to cause harm is just going to expand? Are we closing that gap? What do we need to do?
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for having me here today. This is a great event. I would say that's a tough question. Right now, it's hard to know how that gap is closing. I mean, the adversaries are getting better, at a faster rate. I think we're getting better at a faster rate too. I think that gap was very, very wide 5, 6 years ago, and there's a question as to whether it's gotten wider or whether the path at least is staying the same in terms of our growth on the defensive side. Defense is much, much more difficult. I mean, Rob talked about needing to know offense in order to do defense, but defense is much more difficult than offense in this space. That's part of the trouble here. I think that the risk management approach that Kirsten talked about is the key to us doing better than we have in the past. I think I see that in the private sector clients that I talk to now. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of people that haven't done enough, that haven't done very much at all. But then there are some that have risk management plans, that know what they're doing, that are tied to the NIST framework, that are that measure regularly how they're doing and improve over time. I think that is much better than it was several years ago. So in that way, we are doing much better in terms of figuring out what we need to do. I think the technology is much, much better in this space than it was 5 years ago. You have a lot of different types of technologies out there. I think it's confusing when you go, I'm going to Black Hat next week. You go to the show floor, Black Hat. It is confusing to know what is real and what is not real out there. But there are real endpoint technology protections. There are real service protections out there that you can find what you need to protect yourself and to do the basics out there and to do advanced protection out there as well. I do still worry that while what I've heard you call the cornerstone of U.S. policy in this space, the idea of voluntary effort and working closely with government, private sector working closely with government, is a threat with one major disaster, right? You hear that it was the key, the voluntary nature and that public-private partnership is key, and you can see it all throughout the executive order. You can see it through the way that Rob was talking about it today, and that remains there. But I do still worry that we're just one disaster away from that disappearing.
So thank you, Ari. So let me put this question to the two private sector organizations with large global capabilities. What are you folks doing to keep pace with the threat evolution? What are the most important factors that you think from an executive level perspective are the priorities for your organizations? And then I'd like to finally ask you the question that Rob said. What do you think the government should or must do to help the situation? So Catherine, maybe we start with you.
You want to do most important government?
Whichever,
Okay.
your choice.
For us at this point, at least within CenturyLink, I mean, I think we're fairly mature. We've sort of done the cybersecurity framework and the whole thing. So we kind of follow a process, and this is my language, this would not be Glenn Post's language. And the language sort of goes paranoia, planning, practice. So you're trying to find what's new, what's bubbling, what. And with a drive towards some form of resiliency, so that whatever the paranoia of the moment is, that you have thought about it, that you have a safety net, a fallback, a something. Even if you don't have a solution, you have what's the workaround, what's the mitigation, how do you snap back from whatever the latest crisis might be. And candidly, these crises don't bubble up in the first 30 seconds and you deal with it. Things will start to evolve, and over the course of, let's say, a month to 6 months or something like that, you start to think about this potential impending doom. So in our mind, all of this process, the what's out there, what could possibly take you down, to think about the planning, at the very least, it's some sort of, once again, sort of fail-safe mechanism until you can have something more substantive so that you can then practice it. You're ultimately having the fail-safe safety net to developing a plan, a process, a protocol, so that it ends up becoming just course of business, dealing with it, so that it now then bubbles down and you get a whole new cycle of paranoia to go again. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, well, but first, before I go there, I just wanted to thank you for having me here today and a great event. As everybody else has said, also wanted to thank the administration for their leadership on the issue, in particular on the botnet initiative. A lot of us are heavily involved in that. So botnets are an issue that we've been dealing with for a number of years. So I think it's very appropriate to call that out, and there's a lot of work going on. So just wanted to thank them for showing leadership there, and hopefully we can come up with recommendations from our industry sector that will be relevant on that particular subject. On the question you asked about, I'm going to go back to a quote that my chairman gave at the NIST launch of the framework 4 years ago. He said his number one motivating factor was just fear of being hit with an attack. So I think that is an issue for all big companies. None of us want to be the next victim of a major cyber attack. I think a lot of companies are investing in security capabilities precisely for that reason. I think in terms of keeping up with the threats, as we all know, they're constantly changing. So it's a continual game of investing in we have a very robust security team at AT&T. We invest a lot of money in that. that have research capabilities, and so we're constantly trying to keep up with the latest and greatest on cybersecurity and make sure that we are doing what we have to do to protect our network and our customers. I think that's going to be an ongoing issue in perpetuity. I don't think that there is any one simple answer to that question. So it just requires a lot of due diligence from the top down to make sure that companies are investing and constantly looking out for what's happening and protecting themselves. And the last thing I'll say is one area that we are really focused on right now is kind of migrating our network over towards newer technology architectures like software-defined networks and network function virtualization. Moving towards more virtualized security rings as opposed to kind of the traditional perimeter-based security that people have done in the past. The concept there being that as the threats change, as more and more people have access to your networks, at some level you have to assume that you might be a victim of an attack, and so how do you re-architect the network to make it more inherently resilient and responsive when those things happen, so that you're prepared as opposed to constantly beefing up the perimeter and kind of the old style defense that we saw 10 years ago, which was appropriate at the time and still it has to be done, but a lot of the re-architecting that we're doing is a way to make us inherently more resilient. So I think that's a big focus for the company right now, on top of all the other things that we do to kind of stay ahead of the threat as best we can.
So when I hear you and Catherine talk, I think of, I don't know, Chris, 2,000 cybersecurity professionals working at AT&T, something like that?
Give or take. I mean, we have
Give
quite
or
a few
take,
people on the team.
100.
Yeah, I'm going to quote a number.
Catherine, what's required to support the kinds of activities you talked about are also in the hundreds. Large numbers of people.
Large numbers.
But we also have other sectors, different companies with different sizes who don't have business models that necessarily allow for the recovery that makes it possible for you to test a lot of these technologies and to recover them maybe through some of the business services. Right. So, and I open this question to the entire panel. What can we do to make it more economical for real security in this system? In 13636, the executive order talked about the need for incentives. There were some departments that had written some reports, but I think the general sense is that we really didn't make a lot of progress in dealing with the kind of assistance that may be required for organizations that where the economics of security don't necessarily work. How do we deal with that? How do we make some progress? Who wants to take that first? It's not an easy question.
I'll take part of it. I'll be quick, but I think Rob talked about in the executive order the government moving to shared services, and I think that's one very obvious way to make it more economical for smaller agencies and smaller organizations is to move to the cloud, move more reliance on others helping you. You can't. Not every organization can have a SOC. Not every organization can have hundreds of professionals working in the space, and at some point, things don't scale down to the point where it works out. Some people are going to need to be able to rely on other professionals and experts to
So some functional collaboration, partnership on cybersecurity. Is that what you're thinking about?
No, I'm talking about finding ways to move more information to the cloud and to use shared security services. Okay. Would be more economical for smaller and medium-sized companies and organizations.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
Robert,
Sure.
One of the key elements that came up throughout the commission was in looking at the ISACs and the ISOWs was that small businesses across sector have more in common than they do within their sector. And I know we've talked about this in looking at different sectors. And so actually, and one of the key issues that the commission was asked to address was small and medium-sized businesses. It was also one of the issues that we were asked to look at for the NIST framework. It continues to be a constituency and a key effort that doesn't always get the traction, and there are a lot of independent efforts. I know that US Chamber recently launched something as well to look at this. And as a follow-on to the release of the commission report, a few of the commissioners and Secretary Pritzker have gotten together to look at how do you take the best practices and the challenges of global industry leaders, of large companies, and how do you share those best practices and create content and tools for those companies in your value chain. And value chain looks at cybersecurity as a system, because it is truly understanding the fact that from a risk management perspective, in small and medium-sized businesses and those, as you've talked, that don't have the economic prioritization are always going to struggle to keep that cybersecurity, the risk management, the approach to be as resilient as they need it to be. So being able to create content and tools by those large companies that have access into those, and then also to look across the sector, could be a first starting point. So I think, you rightly asked that question, and it was something that following the commission, I think we still felt hadn't been truly and effectively addressed. So we'll look to see where this effort and this initiative moves, but it's certainly one of the key vulnerabilities, but could also be one of the key opportunities if we approach it the right way.
Tom, what about DHS in this arena?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think a lot of the points definitely resonate with me, and I think with DHS's approaches. I think one of the beauties of the NIST framework and the work that we've done around that is it's obviously intended to be sort of scalable, right? So it's meant to apply differently based on the size of the organization. So I think some of the phrases that jump to mind that sort of apply to how we're looking at kind of critical infrastructure writ large also apply to how companies would think about managing their own risk in terms of prioritization, and to harken back to Ari and Rob's point in terms of modernization and leveraging shared services. So I think at DHS we're certainly looking at how we prioritize our efforts and our engagements with different parts of critical infrastructure, whether it's sort of the Section 9 list, so the most critical of critical infrastructure, or large entities versus small entities. So I think certainly for individual entities, sort of understanding what their priorities are, right? What their kind of what their greatest risks are, what their crown jewels are, and understanding how they can focus their security around that. And to Ari's point, really leveraging those shared services, those commercial services, so you can get the benefit of multiple people developing those types of security capabilities that will benefit you.
Robert?
Yeah.
A lot of the discussion, I agree with everything that's been said. But in my mind, I'm thinking, well, that kind of takes care of the enterprise. And many of the small companies that we rely on, you care about their enterprise, you care about, how do they get their email and stuff like that. But they're providing critical services. Critical services which in and of themselves are not necessarily your email. And you can think about the municipal utilities, water places, you can think about small electrical co-ops. You can think about those kind of businesses where they are producing a service that the community, the region, the state relies on. And they may be small, and yet they may be critical to the economic well-being of that region. So to that end, I'm not sure that necessarily a shared service is going to help, or that they're going to be able to put their water plant in a bubble. So there are going to be some legitimate issues that need to be addressed. And I think that it's going to be a combination, certainly within communications, the stuff that an AT&T or a CenturyLink might do year one does end up trickling down and bubbling into our smaller members, let's say 5 years later. But the speed of this may be such in this cyber environment that the normal trickle down of pioneer to best practice, if you will, may not be fast enough. And whether it's an electric co-op, or if it's the transportation company, or the bus service, or the whatever, I think there's going to have to be some understanding and recognition of the smalls who perform critical functions. I think the smalls who provide critical functions, whether it's the water or whatever, are going to need to be able to assess, what is it they need. And I think that may be a role for government.
I think they have a major workforce challenge in doing that. I think that, we did a lot of work in the recent CISRIC report that we did on information sharing. We had a lot of conversations about small and medium-sized carriers and small and medium-sized businesses, and I think Ari hit it right on the head. I mean, the whole concept of managed services is where a lot of the discussion always ends up going, because the idea that every business out there is going to be able to go hire cyber experts and bring them in and use the framework and learn all these different things, I think is a huge challenge. I know some small or mid-sized carriers have done that. I know others who haven't. It just depends on who it is, right, and what their resources are. So, given the situation that we're in right now, where we're basically saying the federal government doesn't even have enough resources and expertise to deal with security, and large enterprise companies still have challenges in hiring cyber experts because of the shortage that's going on, I think there's going to be an ongoing challenge for all businesses at every level. So really moving towards a managed services model where you can leverage the expertise of other parties, I think is a critical component of any kind of, whether it's a small mid-sized carrier or a small mid-sized business just generally. I think that's where a lot of the discussion is going to have to go. what you can do is do some combination of the two. You can use the framework as a way to kind of model out what your security, risk posture should be, and then you can leverage things like managed services to help you get there. So some combination of the two. But I do think with the workforce challenges that we have, the managed services model is where a lot of this is going to have to go.
Yeah. Let me just clarify something, if I may, Catherine, see if I understand. The acceleration process in terms of moving things from the pioneers to downstream, you said the government can help. I'm trusting that you mean through forms of assistance and not through unfunded mandates.
Of course.
Just wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying.
So Robert, just a point on the IoT side, which is a lot where we've been focusing lately at Commerce, is that we hear this a lot, that the new manufacturers who are making these new network devices, that the margins are thin. It's very difficult for them to build security in. And so two things that we've been trying to do, focus in on at Commerce with our multi-stakeholder processes, is to, one, try to see what we can do about building the market for more security. So when you look at the process that we're doing on patchability, part of that was how do we get the message out to consumers about what they should even be looking for? How can we make this more clear to them so that they understand what they're buying, so they can start looking for those things? And that's one thing that we just released yesterday, some guidance on that. So building that market, but then number two, the innovation piece, because even if the manufacturers do get there, there is going to be this gap time period. And so how do we look at layered solutions in that interim? We're seeing innovation around this right now because the market will jump where they see an opportunity. We're seeing some smart routers developing at both the enterprise and the consumer level, so that there's more management at the LAN level. And so that's what we've been looking to, hoping that the market too will look to fill those gaps where there might be an economic inhibitor in this interim period.
Okay. I think we have a few minutes where I'd like to offer folks in the audience to ask some questions. So, yes, Rick? I think there's a microphone coming around. You can please state your name and affiliation.
Yeah, hi. Rick Weber, Inside Cybersecurity. So I guess I just want to go back to your original question, Robert. Catherine responded to it somewhat, but if all the other panelists could address, well, what role should government play? So if you just go down the list.
In cybersecurity in general, or?
Yeah, small, medium.
Well, Rob Joyce asked the question. He wanted to know what's the value that the government can bring to these processes.
So, on that subject, we've been on the record on this before, talking about how the government can play a really important convening role of bringing the various components of industry together to address these problems. And so, Rob spoke earlier, and he made a really good point about how in order to address like the botnet problem, it requires actions from the entire ecosystem. It's the same thing for IoT. There's a role to play for the device makers and software developers and the network service providers and the cloud providers and the hosting providers. There's a whole ecosystem out there. And so in order to effectively address these problems, it's going to require each of those entities stepping up and working together and trying to do different things. It harkens back to the work that we did with Ari back when he was doing the industry botnet group, back in 2012 maybe, something like that, when we were talking about this, and we had all those same entities involved at the time. And the government has the ability to use its kind of convening role to bring everybody together and try to get industry to work together. That's a lot of what NTIA is doing in the multi-stakeholder process. That's why we've been, at least from an AT&T standpoint, we've been generally supportive of those efforts because we think that's a good role for government to play. So without mandating solutions, getting everybody to the table and kind of talking about what we can all do cooperatively, I think that's generally the role they've been playing, and I would encourage them to continue doing that.
So I agree with everything that's been said so far, but I also, to use a somewhat of a Washington cliche, but I think it's definitely true in this case, the government can get its own house in order in a much better way.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think the EO does a great job of this. I know when I was working with agencies, there was this feeling, well, we already have our budgets, we already have our mission in place for what we're going to do for this in this administration. And it's, everything that we could do was a sort of patching on top of that. So starting from the beginning and saying, we're going to have leadership here, and leadership's going to be held responsible, and you need to make it part of your mission to do cybersecurity, I think does put the challenge to each and every agency in a way that we couldn't do by the time that I was there. So I really like that piece of it. I think that's important. I also think it's important to look at some of the things that NIST has done throughout the years in this space and how it's influenced the private sector, right? The standards that they put forward that are, you know, cataloged in 853, which is the kind of the main piece of all the different cybersecurity controls that are out there, that's used by the private sector. I mean, the people that created PCI told me they went to 853 when they first started looking at what they're going to do for PCI as the starting point, right? So I think NIST has been, the standards that NIST has put forward for the government has ended up influencing the private sector in a very positive way, and that can continue, that we can continue that cycle if we can improve what the government is doing.
Very good.
I would just offer three. I mean, I think the first is when we look at what's being done with government, particularly as a convening body, when we talk about what happened with the framework, and that was really looking at industry driving a process. Like any good success story, what has to happen is an evolution. And so we have to make sure that we've taken these lessons and where success has been, but we have to evolve that model for where the threat continues to go. Because sometimes we get ourselves stuck in what has been successful, and we continue to repeat that without it maturing and without it growing. So we have tremendous best practices and lessons learned from how different projects and efforts have been successful, particularly looking at the framework. But we've got to move them forward, and we've got to look at what that means, particularly as we've all talked about how the threat is growing and where it is. The second point is, I think one of the key elements to the executive order is talking about that each agency head has accountability for its agency cybersecurity, and that's a huge movement forward. I mean, taking a little bit, working off of what Ari said around the government needs to get its house in order. We've been saying that for a while, but actually getting pretty prescriptive as far as where the hierarchy exists and who is responsible. One of the key reasons that the commission was created is because after the OPM breach, President Obama didn't have anybody to turn to who was solely responsible for the cybersecurity of our government. And we're starting to see these things come into play. The third piece gets a little bit more in the weeds, but it's when we're really looking at what can government offer, and this goes to the point about pre-event collaboration and planning. Government knows nation states and knows nation state activity better than any company. A company will go very deep based on its function or its critical need. And if we start to be able to share what that company knows from a depth perspective with what the nation state knowledge of the government is before an event happens, and in a way that is systematic, then we are going to start to see government and industry collaboration work at a much more effective and efficient level where each entity is truly getting something out of that partnership.
So I guess maybe I would just flip the question around a little bit and talk about what I think the biggest challenge, and I'll speak just for the Department of Homeland Security, is. And I think the good news is it's not inconsistent with what anyone from the private sector said in terms of what they would like to see the government do. And I think the biggest challenge for Homeland Security, as I said before, like how we're prioritizing and differentiating our different sort of critical infrastructure entities, right? So how can we match the services and the capabilities that we're trying to make available, or how we're trying to collaborate and how we're trying to partnership, how we can sort of show value in those sort of individual engagements, recognizing that sort of the needs of entities are not the same. And to Catherine's point, right, prioritization has to be focused on kind of criticality, right? So it's not based on sort of who are the biggest players, right? It's who are the most critical players. And you know, not all of the most critical players are necessarily going to be at the same place. So there's different needs that the government can meet. So I think the biggest challenge for the government, the biggest challenge for DHS is how can we sort of show value or find value or make the value proposition in like our engagements with different sectors, with different entities, given that there are different points and they need different things. Or some entities, you know, what they need from us is sort of that type of deep collaboration where we bring together what does the IC know versus what are you seeing sort of affecting your entity. Whereas, you know, other small and medium business, really what they need is some sort of connection to what resources might be available to them. And so I think that is the challenge for us, which is how do we try to sort of meet all those very different needs, you know, in some sort of prioritized way, given, you know, current resource constraints.
And Tom, when you look at Section 9 now as part of this new executive order versus the way it was identified in the previous executive order, You're describing things that might suggest that you might look at critical infrastructure, Section 9, a little bit differently going forward so that you can accommodate for these types of distinctions? Or are you grounded in that same kind of model?
Yeah, so I don't know that the mindset is dramatically different. I think this is the sort of the evolution of how we think about sort of Section 9 entities and what it means for us to have identified under 16366 the most critical of critical infrastructure. So we're now sort of in this EO been tasked with going back and I guess kind of cataloging first what capabilities and authorities exist on the government side, which I think we already had a pretty good sort of handle of, but sort of formalizing that process. And then engaging with those entities and asking them, which of these is most useful to you? I mean, what is the value proposition that you see from the government? How can we accomplish this sort of joint outcome together? I mean, one of the ironies in all of our sort of cybersecurity challenges is that this is one of those cases where the interests of the government and the interests of industry are sort of, I think, completely aligned, right? We are trying to get to a more secure, more resilient infrastructure. That's what the government wants, that's what industry wants. So given that sort of joint interest, collectively, how can we get there? And what are the things that the government can do that are most helpful to you as, sort of a Section 9 entity, because you're someone who's been identified as having some piece of infrastructure that has that true sort of national criticality.
I want to open it up for one or two more questions from the audience. Anybody? Okay. Is there anything left to say that you want to make sure you get to say and not regret having not said it when you leave here?
Well, on the botnet issue, I'd just like to comment on the discussion that's going on there. First off, as I said earlier, I appreciate the administration flagging it as an important issue. We all agree that it's something that needs to be addressed. I think Mr. Joyce earlier, hit the key point that it's going to require activity from the ecosystem. I just want to mention that the ISP community, we just recently put out a white paper on Monday that talks about botnets and kind of some general initial thoughts on what the industry is doing on our side, what the communications sector is doing. So it came out from the Communications Sector Coordinating Council. Mm-hmm. It's out on the website, so it's publicly available. We've given a lot of thought to this particular issue. It dates back several years. As I mentioned earlier, the industry botnet group that Ari was leading, put together a set of principles on botnets that a lot of us are following. There's also the ABCs for ISPs that we developed several years ago. So there's a lot of activity that ISPs are doing, whether it's those types of actions or more technical standards work like BCP 38 implementation or customer notifications or different port blocking efforts that are going on. So there's a lot of activity that ISPs are doing, but that's not the end state. It has to be. It's going to require action from everybody in the ecosystem working together to deal with the problem. And so I just wanted to make sure that folks were kind of tracking some of the activity that's been going on and where we're going with that. And we're looking forward to working with the administration and coming up with a set of recommendations there.
I think a lot of the activity that's going to unfold through your work at NSTAC and the work that you're doing with your comments and the subsequent reports are going to go directly to the issue of how does the ecosystem work together to resolve botnets and automated distributed malware. That document, I believe, is in the packet. The report just came out yesterday. I think Matt Tooley is somewhere in the audience, our brilliant author. There he is, and some of his compatriots. For anybody who wants who stay up at night and read about interesting things about botnets, great paper, great glossary, and with that, I'd like to ask you to thank our audience for what I thought was a very good. And we'll see you back for the 10th USTelecom Cybersecurity Policy Forum.
Sorry.